Welcome back. For this deep dive, we're looking at EU versus Disinfo's analysis from the week of April 21st to 27th, 2025. Now, knowing you, our listeners, are well-versed in Femian disinformation, we're skipping the basics and jumping right into two, well, really persistent narratives highlighted recently. First, the Kremlin's ongoing efforts around the Auschwitz anniversary. And second, those stubborn myths about NATO supposedly provoking the war in Ukraine. Our aim here is to pull out the key insights from the latest EUvsDisinfo pieces on these topics, maybe get a bit more nuance than you'd find elsewhere. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, it's quite striking how these historical narratives, especially emotionally charged ones, are consistently weaponized. They're really central to the Kremlin's current playbook. The Auschwitz anniversary exploitation, the NATO narrative, they're, well, textbook examples.
Okay, let's start with Auschwitz. Russia wasn't at the 80th anniversary back in January 2025. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum cited Russia's aggression against Ukraine as the reason. Predictably, this became fuel for Kremlin disinformation.
Absolutely. They immediately framed it as, Western Russophobia, historical revisionism, and even, quite bizarrely, claimed there's this revival of Nazism happening in the EU and Ukraine.
It's that Nazi brush tactic again, isn't it? Smear anyone who opposes them. But using it in the context of Auschwitz feels particularly, well, egregious.
It is, and it's not just about smearing. It's about trying to delegitimize any opposition, painting resistance to Russian imperialism as somehow equivalent to Nazism. It poisons the whole information environment.
And the historical twisting involved.
Wow.
And they push this idea that the West disrespects the Soviet victory over Nazism, wants to erase Russia's role, positioning Russia as the sole heir to that victory.
Right, which conveniently ignores the massive contributions of others. The EU versus Disinfo piece rightly points out, for instance, about 7 million Ukrainians fought in the Red Army. They were a huge part of the forces, especially on, the really brutal fronts like the Southwestern Front. Ukraine itself was devastated.
So it's not about denying the Soviet contribution. It's about acknowledging the full picture, the shared sacrifice.
Exactly, but that doesn't fit the narrative of Russia as the inheritor of all Soviet glory and the dominant historical force. It minimizes the suffering and agency of others, especially Ukraine.
And then it gets even more twisted. The Kremlin says the West is erasing Holocaust memory by not inviting Russia,
Yeah.
while at the same time condemning the fact that Zelensky was invited, painting him as some kind of promoter of neo-Nazi ideology. It's just upside down.
It's a complete inversion. Russia, the aggressor state, tries to seize the moral high ground associated with the Holocaust. It's cynical. They're trying to hijack the symbolism of Auschwitz to deflect from their own actions, equating support for Ukraine with supporting Nazism. It's blatant manipulation.
Putin himself doubled down on this. He talked about Russian citizens being the direct descendants of the victorious generation that liberated Auschwitz. That wording seems quite deliberate, doesn't it? Minimizing others.
Very deliberate. And repeating the revival of Nazi ideology in the West Line. Plus that chilling bit on Holocaust Remembrance Day, equating Russophobia with anti-Semitism and racism.
That's the weaponization of victimhood right there, portraying modern Russia as the victim of the same Nazi West.
It's a core tactic. Conflate any criticism of the Russian state's actions with historical persecution, with Nazism, with anti-Semitism. It aims to shut down debate by painting critics as proponents of genocide.
And they set conditions for even discussing the Holocaust, basically. You'd have to accept their version of history, acknowledge the Soviet war effort as they define it, and denounce Kyiv as neo-Nazi. Disagree. You're a historical revisionist.
It's authoritarian history control, dictating the past to serve the present. These non-negotiable terms just lock down their preferred narrative.
Maria Zakharova, of course, echoed all this, accusing Europeans of insulting Red Army heroes and Holocaust victims, calling it a monstrous version of the segregation that led to Nazism.
And her claim that the West erased the memory about the Holocaust victims, that flies directly in the face of the huge amount of international media coverage the 80th commemoration actually received.
It's that sheer volume of falsehoods, isn't it? The fire hose strategy. Overwhelmed with lies.
Precisely. So confusion make it hard to even track the truth.
And remember that completely fabricated quote attributed to Poland's chief rabbi calling Zelensky a dictator with Nazis on a leash. EUvsDisinfo traced it back to Russian telegram channels, then amplified by official outlets.
A perfect illustration of the Femi pipeline they've documented. Seeded in the gray zones, then launder it through state media. Textbook.
Then you get the really extreme stuff. like Sergei Markov claiming Europeans basically organized the Holocaust and a Russian genocide, and that the Auschwitz commemoration proves Europe is ready for another one.
While extreme, it serves a purpose. It reinforces the core message. The West is inherently dangerous, hostile, maybe even genocidal towards Russia. It justifies anything in response.
This all seems to feed into that broader genocide of the Soviet people concept they've been pushing since around 2020.
Yes. By framing the Soviet people with Russia as the successor state, as the main victims of Nazism, and demanding Germany recognize things like the siege of Leningrad as genocide.
They try to relativize or downplay the specific, unique nature of the Holocaust against the Jewish people, fold it into this larger Soviet-centric victim narrative.
Exactly. It allows them to position Russia today as facing a similar existential threat, fighting the same evil Nazi West.
So the ideological endgame here is exploit the Holocaust, twist history, to create this narrative where Russia is once again fighting Nazis, only this time it's the EU and Ukraine who are supposedly supporting genocide in Donbass.
That's the core of it. Using the ultimate historical evil to legitimize current aggression and demonize anyone standing in their way.
Which makes Pyotr Chawisky's statement, the director of the Auschwitz Museum, so pointed. He basically said, there's no place at Auschwitz for people accusing Ukraine of Nazism and claiming the West is threatening Russia with another Holocaust.
He cut right through the disinformation, didn't he? Highlighting the moral and historical incompatibility of the Kremlin's narrative with the reality and memory of Auschwitz. That's why they weren't welcome.
Okay, let's pivot to the second major theme, that persistent myth about NATO provocation. The idea that NATO expansion forced Russia to invade Ukraine. Still a staple, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial for them. It shifts the blame, paints Russia as the reluctant defender against Western aggression rather than the aggressor.
And the classic starting point is myth number one. NATO broke a promise not to expand 1 inch eastward.
A promise for which, as EUvsDisinfo reiterates, there's simply no formal evidence, no treaty, no legally binding document.
Right. There were discussions, yes, around German reunification, but no overall commitment on future NATO enlargement beyond Germany. Even Gorbachev himself has said there was no such promise regarding wider expansion.
And in international relations, you need something concrete, right? A treaty, a public, documented agreement. Russia never secured one, never really pushed for one in that way at the time. Verbal assurances, especially in complex negotiations, just aren't the same.
Plus, this whole narrative completely erases the agency of Eastern European countries. It wasn't NATO sourcing itself on them.
Exactly. Think about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania. After decades under Soviet domination or influence, they wanted to join NATO for their own security. It was about self-determination, escaping Moscow's shadow.
Okay, myth number two. Ukraine was about to join NATO. Russia had no choice.
Also false. As the analysis points out, Ukraine was nowhere near NATO membership in early 2022. No membership action plan, no fast track, no invitation pending.
That December 2021 ultimatum from Russia demanding guarantees Ukraine would never join, demanding NATO roll back its presence from countries that joined after 1997, that wasn't a serious diplomatic proposal, was it?
It looked much more like setting impossible demands to create a pretext, a justification for actions they likely already planned to take.
And maybe the strongest rebuttal comes from Putin himself. His big speech right before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, what was the focus?
Not primarily NATO, was it? It was all about questioning Ukraine's very right to exist. Ukraine as an artificial construct of Lenin, historically Russian land. That points to imperial aims, not defensive fears about NATO.
And the irony, of course, is the invasion achieved the opposite of what they supposedly feared. It united the West, strengthened NATO's eastern flank, pushed Finland and Sweden into NATO.
Precisely. If the genuine fear was NATO expansion, the invasion was counterproductive. It suggests the NATO excuse was just that, an excuse.
Then there's myth three. Russia feared NATO on its border.
Yet, their actions in February 2022 suggest they were pretty confident NATO wouldn't intervene directly to defend Ukraine. They attacked a large country neighboring several NATO members.
NATO leaders were also very clear from the start. No NATO troops fighting Russia in Ukraine.
Right. If you genuinely fear a powerful military alliance on your border, do you launch a massive invasion of its neighbor, practically guaranteeing that alliance will reinforce its presence and pay much closer attention to you? It doesn't add up. The fear seemed more about losing control over Ukraine, about Ukraine choosing a Western path.
And myth four, the Western-led coup in Ukraine in 2014.
Again, erasing Ukrainian agency. The revolution of dignity wasn't led by the West. It was driven by Ukrainians demanding change after Yanukovych rejected the EU association agreement under Russian pressure and then cracked down violently on protesters.
It was about corruption, reform, and choosing their own future, away from Moscow's grip. Framing it as a coup denies the popular will.
And it ignores Putin's own long-stated views, like in his July 2021 essay, basically dismissing Ukrainian sovereignty. The motivations seem consistently imperial, not defensive.
You could also argue there's a fear of democracy itself, couldn't you? A successful democratic Ukraine on Russia's border might give Russians ideas.
That's certainly a plausible factor. The threat isn't military, perhaps, but ideological. The example of a neighboring Slavic country choosing a different, non-authoritarian path.
So the conclusion from EUvsDisinfo seems clear. NATO is largely a pretext. The war is about Russia's desire for control, power, denying Ukraine's sovereignty.
It's a convenient narrative to mask deeper imperialistic motivations and a refusal to accept a multipolar world where former Soviet republics choose their own alliances.
Just briefly touching on a couple other things flagged this past week, we saw more of that deep state narrative popping up in Europe, trying to explain why support for Ukraine continues.
Yes, the shadowy forces supposedly forcing the war onwards. A classic conspiracy trope applied to this context.
And attempts to blame Zelensky for a Russian missile attack in Sumy, which was quickly debunked by, actual reports from the ground showing anger directed at Russia.
Shifting blame, sowing confusion, standard procedure.
Also, accusations against the EU regarding media freedom in Moldova, claiming the EU encouraged censorship when a TV license was suspended.
When in fact the EU ambassador called for transparency in the process, and the EU consistently advocates for media freedom standards. Another distortion.
So wrapping up this week's analysis, the main takeaway really seems to be the interconnectedness of it all. How historical narratives like the Holocaust manipulation and geopolitical myths like NATO expansion are woven together.
Yes, they aren't separate threads. They form a complex tapestry designed to justify Russian actions, undermine opponents, and shape perceptions both domestically and internationally. It's a sophisticated, multi-layered effort.
And for anyone following this space, recognizing these persistent tactics, how they evolve but often rely on the same core deceptive frameworks is just crucial.
Absolutely. Understanding the strategy behind the individual lies is key.
Okay, thanks for walking us through that. It really highlights the consistency and, frankly, the cynicism involved. So maybe a final thought for our listeners to consider. Given how interconnected and sophisticated these campaigns are, moving beyond just debunking, what might more effective long-term counters look like in practice? Something to mull over.